In 1914, the remote village of Ingham was first connected to the outside world by a bus route. And over the next 30 years, the bus became a vital lifeline to this small community. Then, as these villagers remember, it was the bus that brought freedom at the end of the Second World War.
Here we are again. Off to Lincoln.
Throughout the war, Lincoln's buses suffered terribly. This coach was packed with passengers when it was hit by an incendiary bomb. The few buses that survived till the VE Day parade were decrepit and uncomfortable. It was the same all over Britain. In Nottingham in 1945, these pre-war Leyland cheetahs were clearly overstretched. As few people had cars, trips to the shops, the cinema, or even the recently reopened beaches were nearly always made by bus. Britain's bus makers realised that the next generation of buses would have to carry many more passengers. And in the search for extra capacity, bus design, which had previously been conservative, began a decade of radical technological innovation. In Britain, the post-war recovery of the 40s and 50s was accompanied by a superficial stability. Bus services, like many important industries, were strictly regulated, and the law guaranteed most operators impregnable monopolies. There was even a law against running a double-decker without a conductor.
I came out of the army and I wanted a job, and I thought, well, if I got on the buses, it would be a regular job. That's what I done. And as I say, it was a regular job for 31 years.
The vehicle in which Reg Durrant began conducting was called a trolley. Ipswich had nothing else at the time. Trolleys were everywhere once. Halfway between the outgoing trams and the incoming motor buses, they were powered by electricity. Ipswich Council, which owned the town bus service, had chosen trolleys to replace its trams, mainly because it owned the local electricity grid. But here, as elsewhere, the trolleys thrived on the post-war flood of passengers.
It was nice, quiet vehicles and easy to drive. There was no noise, no pollution, and they were popular with the public.
The reasons for this popularity lay under the trolley's floor. A direct current at a potentially lethal 600 volts was fed into a bank of resistors. The driver used these resistors to vary the voltage that was filtered through to spin an electric traction motor. As the voltage varied, so did the speed. It was quieter, smoother, and faster than a combustion engine.
Personally, I think they were the ideal mode of transport for town work. The only restriction, of course, was the fact that you had all the overhead wiring, and that restricted you to where you travelled on the road. If you travelled too far away from the wires, you had a bit of an accident and off came your trolley arms and you lost your power. And I remember on one particular occasion, it was a very, very foggy morning, and we wandered too far. In fact, I ended up on that particular occasion with the nose of the bus quite near the front of a public house, which was some distance from where I should have been.
For decades, the limits of the Trolley's overhead electricity grid contained Ipswich. But by the late 40s, the town had begun to spread. New homes, to replace the industrial slums the Luftwaffe had destroyed, were built in pleasant housing estates on the outskirts of town. But the council couldn't afford to expand the Trolley's electricity grid to reach them. That's why in 1950, the diesel-powered AEC Regent, which had already proved itself alongside trolleys in London, was introduced into Ipswich. The Regent used a huge 9.6-litre diesel engine, a fluid flywheel and hydraulic brakes to mimic the smooth ride of a trolley. Gear changes were further smoothed by a pre-selector. A driver pre-selected a new gear whenever there was time. Later, when road conditions demanded that gear change, it was triggered and was shifted automatically by compressed air. The passengers hardly felt a thing, but then they were so desperate for a bus, they wouldn't have cared anyway.
We gradually saw the estate being built round us, and I think it was about 2 years before the buses came up here.
We were a bit isolated really up here to start with, but when the buses came, we felt that we were more into the town.
I visited relatives more than I did without the buses.
We used to go to the pub and have a sing-song and come home. We used to play the piano, and there you are. That was especially Saturday nights.
Saturday nights was a balmy night.
And all the essentials such as chemists and all things like that, you relied on the bus to be able to get into town, to be able to get those kind of things.
Tooraloo, tooralay, it's a jolly fine club and let's keep it that way.
Gradually, more and more Ipswich bus routes became diesel-powered. Diesel meant flexibility. And gradually, the inflexible trolleys were put out to grass, until eventually there was just one left.
When I drove the last one out of service, last one to ever operate in Ipswich, on service, it was Friday, August the 23rd, 1963. All the normal people that were on board were fare-paying passengers. They paid their fare and they had a ride. Although we were due in the shed here at 6:57, I think it was about 20 minutes to 8 before we got in. So we were delayed with all the sort of amateur photographers that come from all over and transport enthusiasts. Once we got to the depot here, the news must have spread because all the locals were outside and they wanted autographs and so forth, so I felt quite an important person at the time. Quite an occasion, really. Sad in many ways.
All that's left of the trolleys is their grid of wires and poles, which now carries domestic electricity, and is a reminder of how much this town once depended on trolleys. At the edge of town stands the last pole, and at its base is a turning circle. Here, this was as far as the trolleys could travel, and it still marks the boundary between urban Ipswich and rural Suffolk. Out-of-town buses were very different, thanks to Bedford, a British subsidiary of the American conglomerate General Motors. Bedford repackaged its austere pre-war OB with radical styling. With its small and reliable petrol engine, the OB would do 12 miles to the gallon while cruising at 40 miles an hour. Coach travel offered affordable luxury, and clever operators were quick to exploit its full potential. Some even made films about it.
Yes, that's the old Huntingdon Street office.
Yes.
Of course, that was a big place, wasn't it?
Elson Barton's family once owned the bus operation in Nottingham. During the 50s, the Barton family firm laid on film shows in local village halls. As a film was projected, timetables and publicity brochures were handed out to an audience of potential passengers. The films were of Barton's continental coach holidays. These were tours, styled on the then popular sea cruises. In fact, Barton promoted a tour as
a road cruise, using the best of hotels, the best bus he could find, everything all in at a single price.
As late as 1950, with car ownership still stuck at its pre-war level, few Britons holidayed abroad. So a road cruise was considered very exotic, and the coaches reflected that.
Oh, this is at Dover.
This is Dover Whitefish Hotel, isn't it?
Yes, it's one of the...
and the vehicle, here she comes,
yes.
That's right.
It
was a Leyland Royal Tiger.
With a Burlington coach on it.
Burlington body, yes.
Burlington body on it, yes. We had two of those, didn't we?
We did.
Yes,
yes.
which were did
very modern in design
yes,
at the time, but they were terrific weight.
They used to
They
have
rub them away, didn't they?
Yes,
Rub
they
the
used to
tires
have
away.
to lift them on the, crane them on the
the
ferry,
ferry,
didn't
that's
they?
right.
And we had to pay a lot more money
Yes.
because they were heavy, weren't
That's right, a terrific weight.
Hard work.
But the Leyland's weight made them graceful cruisers. This was first-class travel.
Down by the level.
And the coach was always spotless. It had lovely headrests every day, clean ones, and when you went to anywhere, they sort of made you so welcome. So it was yes, the service was first class. Always helped out with the coach. Your luggage was always taken to your room. You were always asked each day if everything was okay.
Mind you, you needed a few quid.
I know there were farmers and there was an accountant and there were a couple of shopkeepers. They were all fairly middle class.
Bank managers, solicitors, people who owned their own business.
Continental Europe, still slowly recovering from the war, must have been shocked by the unashamed opulence of a road cruise. These machines, with their two-tone paintwork and chrome trimmings, were the flagships of a very self-confident industry. This 1951 Bristol L was a rare early prototype of a bus layout that is everywhere today. The single-decker coach with its engine under the floor. In the 50s, buses had huge engines, which covered a floor area equivalent to that occupied by 6 passengers. So underfloor engined coaches could earn 6 more fares than a traditional front-engine vehicle, and offered operators a significant economic advantage. And with the engine out of the way, the entrance could go at the front. Drivers could collect fares, so operators could do away with conductors. By the early 50s, coaches had become mobile boxes, often very profitable ones. Even remote rural routes had full loads, and not just during the daytime peaks, but also late at night.
There would be people going for outings and people going to the cinema, because at that time, of course, there were late night buses to get you back out to the villages, something that by and large we've long since forgotten. And so there would be a whole kaleidoscope of people using these buses.
But parts of that kaleidoscope were beginning to fade. In 1950, less than 500,000 British homes had television. By 1960, over 10 million were tuning in. As more people stayed in, the highly profitable late-night bus services declined rapidly. Sadly, bus operators failed to see the implications of the goggle box. In fact, many rural services were far more concerned with contemporary advances in double-decker bus technology.
Of course, one of the problems that bus operators have had right from the early days, since they went over to closed-top buses, is the height of them. And around the country, as people will know, there are many, many low bridges. Of course, some of them far too low for a double-decker, would have to be single-deckers to go underneath. But many bridges, if the bus was just a little bit lower, it would go under. The solution to this was to build a lower height double-decker with a sunken gangway upstairs on the offside and 4 seats together. And when you sat upstairs, your head virtually touched the ceiling. If you sat downstairs on the offside, when you got up from your seat, you had to be careful not to bang your head on the sunken gangway. And the things were generally not terribly satisfactory.
This Bristol K was given a 53-seat low-height body by Row of Leeds in 1950, when it was operated by Keighley Transport on routes across the Yorkshire moors. For a while, this unsatisfactory gimcrack bus layout dominated rural transport, until it was superseded by something much better, the Bristol Low-Decker. The route 103 into Lincoln was serviced by this low-decker in 1954. Although it crawled along, taking an hour and 40 minutes to complete its 30-mile route, it was low enough to fit under a 14-foot bridge, and it had a normal full arrangement of seats on both floors. The low-decker was ingenious.
Well, here we are underneath a low-decker. As you can see, it's a normal front-engined bus with a rear platform. But what makes this bus so special is that here, when we come back to the gearbox, instead of the drive shaft coming out of the centre of the gearbox, it comes out of the side and runs down off-centre to drive the rear axle. Now this allowed the Bristol company to install this, which is a sunken lower deck gangway, and the seats are on platforms either side of it. And so this made it possible to bring down the upper deck floor. And then when we get here to the rear axle, this too was revolutionary, because this was a drop centre axle, whereas before they had gone, the axle went across at the centre point of the wheels. This one is, as you can see, is significantly lower. And here we see the gangway dropping down to the rear platform, which is this boarded area here.
The low-decker remained in production until 1968, and over 5,000 were made. Luckily, this low-decker has been preserved by a local museum because, back out on the Lincoln Edge, it jogs revealing memories in its old passengers, most of whom haven't met for 30 years.
That was the only way I could get to Lincoln, was on the bus.
Ah, that's right.
That used to be at half past 6.
Half past 6 at Billingham Hilltop.
That's right, yeah. And
we used to catch it at 7:15.
Yeah, well, sometimes I didn't get home till 10 o'clock at night.
No, you didn't, my dear.
During the summer, once or twice, I usually relied on my sister here, but if my sister wasn't travelling, I had to rely on you to wait me up at Ingham, so I would frequently nod off.
Sleep didn't come easily on a low-decker. Noisy and bumpy, it had been designed to maximise capacity, not comfort.
Of course, the company peaked, as did many others, in 1952 or thereabouts, and services then began to go into decline with the rise of the private car.
By the end of the 50s, car ownership was almost treble its 1945 level, and still climbing fast. The demand for bus services was now in steep decline. But the struggle to fit more bums on more seats was still in full swing, with the Leyland Atlantean, the first bus to put the engine at the back. In this case, the engine was Leyland's own 9.8-litre unit, mounted sideways. With this huge power plant out of the way, passenger capacity climbed to a giddy 78 seats. And with the entrance at the front, the way was open for conductorless double-deckers. With the Atlantean, all buses, both double and single-deckers, became standardised boxes. The period of radical innovation had reached its peak. Bus travel has never been the same since that golden era.